Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome, one and all, to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month, we extend happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This is your devoted host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse film discussion group. And if you have just discovered our program, welcome. If you're a regular listener, we are of course thrilled that you're back. Watching movies, it's kind of a spectator sport. We sit enthralled, paying attention to the characters on the screen, and become more intrigued as the story unfolds, allowing us a privileged peek inside the private lives of these personalities. But what is this experience like when we're watching one character, watching other characters surreptitiously, and thereby invading their privacy with this spying? In this case, living vicariously through that character can make you feel excited and conflicted at the same time, even if the spying character means well and is trying to solve a crime. Well, these are the emotions that Alfred Hitchcock intended to elicit when he made what is surely the greatest film ever on the subject of voyeurism, Rear Window, originally released on August 4th, 1954. This month, Cineversary commemorates the 70th anniversary of this all-time classic, which remains likely the master of suspense's most beloved work. Joining me this time around will be two outstanding guests. We'll first hear from Patrick McGilligan, author of Alfred Hitchcock, A Life in Darkness and Light, and also an adjunct professor of film at Marquette University. Then we'll get a visit from Josh Larsen, co-host of the Film Spotting podcast and author of Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror. Together, we'll take a telephoto lens and a set of binoculars to this picture and explore the craftsmanship and thematic brilliance of Rear Window and its lasting influence. Prior to pulling back the curtain on our Rear Window Gabfest, however, we should set the proper scene by briefly examining how this film came to be and how it's regarded today. Here's where Wikipedia can help. Rear Window is a 1954 American mystery thriller directed by Alfred Hitchcock and written by John Michael Hayes, based on Cornell Woolrich's 1942 short story It Had to Be Murder. Originally released by Paramount Pictures, the film stars James Stewart, Grace Kelly, Wendell Corey, Thelma Ritter, and Raymond Burr. The narrative concerns L.B. Jeffries, also known as Jeff, a photographer recovering from a broken leg who, confined to his apartment, begins spying on his neighbors through his rear window. Jeff becomes suspicious that Lars Thorwald, one of his neighbors, has murdered his wife, leading Jeff, his girlfriend Lisa, and his nurse Stella to investigate. The movie was shot entirely at Paramount Studios, which included an enormous indoor set to replicate a Greenwich Village courtyard. Set designers spent 6 weeks building the extremely detailed and complex set, which ended up being the largest of its kind at Paramount. The film was made on a budget of $1 million back in the day and grossed $37 million at the box office, which in today's dollars would equate to over $431 million. The movie ended up getting 4 Academy Award nominations, but unfortunately didn't win any Oscars. Rear Window is often ranked among the greatest films ever made. The American Film Institute ranked it number 42 in its 100 Years, 100 Movies list. 10 years later, it placed number 48 in that list. It also placed number 14 in AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills list, and number 3 in the AFI's Top 10 Mysteries list. In 1998, Time Out magazine conducted a poll, and the film was voted the 21st greatest of all time. In the British Film Institute's 2012 Sight and Sound polls of the finest films ever made, Rear Window was ranked 53rd among critics and 48th among directors. In 2017, Empire magazine's Readers' Poll placed Rear Window at number 72 on its list of the 100 greatest movies. The 2022 edition of the magazine's Greatest Films of All Time list, meanwhile, had the film at 38 in the critics' poll. Additionally, in 2022, Time Out magazine had the film at number 26 on its list of the 100 best thriller films of all time. Rear Window today gets a 9.5 out of 10 critical rating at Rotten Tomatoes, where its fresh score is 98% versus a 95% audience score. Over at Metacritic, meanwhile, the numbers are even higher, where the film earns a perfect Metascore of 100. Feast your ears now on the great re-release trailer for Rear Window.
This is the scene of the crime. A crime of passion, filmed in a way you have never seen before, and as no one else would dare attempt. But the screen's master of suspense, the producer-director who shocked the world with Psycho. This is the apartment of a man named Jeffries, a news photographer whose beat used to be the world. Right now, his world has shrunk down to the size of this window. He's been watching the people across the way. Nobody seems to pull their blinds during a hot spell like this. He knows a lot about them by now. Too much, perhaps. For instance, down there on the second floor, the woman pacing about. He calls her Miss Lonely Hearts. So lonely that even death seems like a friend. These are the newlyweds on a honeymoon no one will ever forget. He calls her Miss Hearing Aid, an artist of a very odd and strange art. The songwriter who plays the same melody over and over again. A genius or insane? This is the traveling salesman and his invalid wife. Out of their arguments and nagging comes a weird kind of love. Miss Torso, the body beautiful. That is, viewed from a safe distance.
Those are just a few of my neighbors. First, I watched them just to kill time, but then I couldn't take my eyes off them, just as you won't be able to.
And you won't be able to take your eyes off the glowing beauty of Grace Kelly, who shares the heart and curiosity of James Stewart in this story of a romance shadowed by the terror of a horrifying secret.
Alrighty, it's that time of the show to caution you that we will be traversing down spoiler territory in the conversations ahead. So if Rear Window remains a blind spot, here's your chance to put our show on pause as you catch up. Because you don't want a great plot to be ruined by some premature intelligence. Right, Stella?
Intelligence. Nothing has caused the human race so much trouble as intelligence.
We turn now to Patrick McGilligan, a film historian, adjunct professor of film at Marquette University, and author of several books, including Alfred Hitchcock, A Life in Darkness and Light, Jack's Life, a biography of Jack Nicholson, and Young Orson, The Years of Luck and Genius on the Path to Citizen Kane. Patrick, welcome to Cineversary.
Thank you for inviting me.
I was such a huge fan of your Hitchcock book years and years ago. I knew eventually our paths would cross, and I was hoping you'd say yes, and you did. So wonderful to speak with you today about one of the great masterworks of Alfred Hitchcock. Do you recall, Patrick, when you first watched Rear Window? What was your reaction at the time, and what's your opinion of the film today?
To be honest, I don't remember the exact time. I'm sure it was in college, because in college I fell in with a lot of kids who were older than me, who were from the East Coast. Some of them were graduate students. They were very sophisticated. They'd seen films late at night on TV, and then I ran a film society. So I started catching up with all kinds of things I had never even thought about before, and that includes Hitchcock. Someone asked me once, when was the first time for a book? Did I remember seeing Psycho for the first time? Now, Psycho I could have seen in real time. I was old enough, and I didn't see it. I didn't have a movie-going youth. I started going to movies in college, started becoming a film student, started to hang out with grad students who knew everything about film, and that's probably when I saw Rear Window. My admiration and love for it has grown. I was seeing so much that it was hard to necessarily, for something like that to stand out when I was that young. And then, I think it's a film. The great thing about the film is you can approach it on a popular level and enjoy it, but it does have a lot of depth and resonance for people who follow Hitchcock's career.
I'd love to ask you so many different questions on this film because I know you've studied it, you've watched it multiple times. That begs the question, how many times would you say? What's your count up to now on Rear Window?
Too many times. Uh,
Is this a film you teach in your class?
I have taught Hitchcock,
Mhm.
and then I always show Rear Window, of course, because even if I'm teaching Hitchcock, I have to choose what to teach. But to be honest, it is one of my two or three most favorite Hitchcock films, and it depends on mood,
Mm.
which is my favorite. But therefore, I enjoy re-seeing it. It's nearly a perfect film.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, I'd rank it number 3. I'd put it right behind Vertigo and Psycho, but boy, they're really close. So as you said, it's difficult to choose. But yeah, always a treat to revisit. I think it satisfies on multiple levels. It can serve as, a thrilling popcorn movie escapism entertainment. It's a mystery thriller in which you, like Jeff, try to piece together clues to solve a crime and catch a killer. And it's also, in another way, a metafilm study of the way that we, the audience, watch movies and engage in active voyeurism as Jeff does. So, like you said, satisfies on multiple levels.
I agree, and all done by a voyeur director. So it's
Yes.
like a Chinese box in that respect.
So let's get into it a little deeper here, Patrick. Why does Rear Window deserve to be celebrated 70 years later? It is the 70th birthday month of this film. What elements elevate it from a great movie to an all-time masterpiece?
Well, I find because I teach film that, sometimes, first of all, as I said, I started watching film seriously in college, and before that, didn't think of film seriously. And so I've had a lot of time to think about what makes a film last and what makes a film not last. And
Sure.
you'd be surprised at, the reaction of kids or students to some Hitchcock films. For example, they cannot watch Vertigo even without snickering because the special effects and something else about the plot, you know, strikes them as implausible, improbable, not real.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for Hitchcock fans, that's a great movie in part because it brings back so many themes of Hitchcock and explores them in their most deepest way. But this doesn't matter at all to someone watching the film for the same time for the first time. The same with Marnie. But for example, you show them Psycho, and a lot of them have never seen Psycho, so they're seeing it for the first time. And even though they're jaded and have seen all kinds of gore and violence in movies, they're caught up in it,
Yes.
and they really don't find it dated. They find it creepy and scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I find the same thing is true of Rear Window. They don't find it dated. They find it involving, and they're caught up in it. And why that is, I think, as you hinted a little bit earlier, is first of all, it's a supremely crafted mystery in which the audience is also playing detective.
Sure.
I think it's also those two people are so good, and the other people are very good too. But the two main people are so good, and you like them so much, and you want them to go to bed together. You want that romance to work out. And
Sure. You're wondering what the heck's wrong with Jeff? He doesn't see the wonders right in front of his eyes.
yeah, and it really doesn't have to do with, what's corny and what's not corny, because,
Mm-hmm.
I can show It Happened One Night, which is a very corny movie, and the kids get wrapped up in it. The people are so delightful. The world that is created is so credible, even if it's false. Hitchcock was never making realistic films. That wasn't his deal.
Master fabricator, absolutely, yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And his ability to create a story and then plunge you into the middle of it and make you feel as if you're involved in the story emotionally and psychologically, it was at times just the greatest, which is why, filmmakers adore him as well as fans. So I think it's less dated, than most movies and even than some Hitchcock movies.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and I absolutely buy everything you're saying. I would add to what you said. Rear Window, I think it remains a masterwork thanks in large part to its efficient storytelling in particular. Much of the film's power, to me, lies in its ability to show without telling, to use images and what they call pure cinema to convey its narrative visually without having to resort to unnecessary or lengthy exposition via dialogue or narration. So it's that efficient storytelling, and Hitchcock is very good at this, but particularly in Rear Window, where you've got a confined setting, you establish things right from the beginning with the opening shots without any words, just some sound effects and some, panning across the room, if you will. And it just sets the template right there that in some ways this movie works as a silent film, right? So I really admire that. I really admire what the film accomplishes with masterful suspense techniques, but without using any visible corpses or gore or graphic violence. Now, of course, he's limited in 1954.
I agree. It's a great script. It's a great visual script. I write in my book that Hitchcock was very wedded to the silent period, and he didn't like to use words if he didn't have to. And he would frequently write them down, or they might be in the script, and he'd cut them, in the editing room. So, for example, you say the opening of the film, there's that, that slow montage of the photographs on Jeff's or Jimmy Stewart's wall, showing us without any narration that this guy is a famous photographer who travels the world and shoots fashion models and celebrities in dangerous events and war zones, ending with the racing car that explodes with the wheel, hurling towards the camera, and probably the photograph that broke his leg, and then we meet him, and then we become voyeurs, as you said, with him and with Hitchcock, peeking across this courtyard into the windows of people and watching their what Hitchcock called little lives. He said with certain movies, Lifeboat is another one, but it was something he aspired to do now and then, which was to create a sort of pocket universe where there was not just one story, but many stories, and people represented other groups of people. And so, we look across and we're interested in the lonely widow. We're interested in the guy plunking out a song on the piano. We're very interested in the woman who's undressed and doing stretches, and the couple with their dog, or, who Jimmy Stewart labels the dog who knew too much. And this is so supremely crafted, but it's crafted. It's John Michael Hayes who wrote the script, and it's based on a Cornell Woolridge novella under one of his pen names, William Irish. And these were not inconsiderable collaborators. These were, Hitchcock needed that jumping off point. He needed like an idea like Cornell Woolridge had of a guy with a broken leg stuck in an apartment during a hot summer, looking across the courtyard and sensing that there was some crime afoot. He needed that. He loved that kind of premise. Then he needed somebody to write because he could write. His wife could write, and they did write almost all the time, a little bit. But at this point, he's a producer. He's the director. He's got his television show just about to get going. He's super busy, so he always has a writer. Usually, he has multiple writers. But, I quote his assistant director, who was really his assistant producer, Herbert Coleman, who said, he'd call John Michael Hayes in, and he did like he did with all writers. He'd say, now, this is what happens in this scene, and the camera will show this, and then the camera will show that, and then we will see this, and then they will come in, and then John, you will write something for them to say here.
And everything you're demonstrating right there, Patrick, it speaks to how the film was formed in Hitchcock's mind, often very early on.
Yeah. And I write in the book that this actually, 1954, Paramount, Rear Window, after when he comes to America, there's certain periods of Hitchcock's career, and they all have characteristics, they all have qualities, they all have problems. So the first period is Selznick and the attempt to get away from Selznick. And then the second period is his own company, Transamerica and Warner Brothers, which kind of climaxes with Strangers on a Train. So again, great stuff and some stuff that isn't so good. This is his golden period because he finally, through Lou Wasserman, he never had the power of being a producer, the power to cast and anybody he wanted. Michael Hayes knew before he wrote word one of the script. He knew what the plot was, the story was, and who the actors were. He knew it was going to be James Stewart, Grace Kelly, and Thelma Ritter. So he knew a lot, before he started writing. And then Hitchcock told him everything else he needed to know. Did he need a writer? Yeah, it's because he liked writers. He liked writers' ideas. He liked their ideas for dialogue. But he would say, in this scene, this is what will happen.
Yes.
This is what we'll see. And then you're going to write something like this.
It's a really interesting working relationship, no question. But again, he had a vision of what was going to be filmed long before camera started rolling. And of course, the famous storyboards and everything else. So yeah, he very meticulously planned.
Yes, yeah, he did that. And when people say, I was on the set of Family Plot, and he did look incredible, utterly bored.
Yeah.
He was old and he was not in good health. The joke about him saying it was boring to film was there was a great truth to that for him, because he had seen it all in his mind.
Yeah.
He had written it all down. Then he drew pictures of every scene, so he knew camera and the lighting and the composition was going to
Yeah,
be.
in his mind, he'd already climbed Everest, right? Now the actual climbing of it wasn't so fun.
Yeah, now he had to go in and put the screws and the nuts and the bolts together, and that was work, and it was a little
Sure,
tedious,
sure.
but he knew what he was going to get.
But I like what you laid out this case for the really fine writing, the screenplay, as you demonstrated, and I think this could be Hitchcock's most perfectly realized and airtight masterpiece. So what do I mean by that? It doesn't suffer from plot holes or crime implausibilities, as you said, Vertigo might. The female love interest, I think, has more gravitas, is more memorable than, let's say, I don't know, Eva Marie Saint's character in North by Northwest. There's no unnecessary scene like the psychobabble explanation tacked on to the end of Psycho, so there's no fat. And the incredible set is more impressive than anything, at least prior, Hitchcock did, including Rope, which is a pretty impressive set.
For me, it's a mood thing. If I would consider it to be a very romantic movie, Rear Window, and a very humorous movie throughout, without being comical, hardly ever. And so in a way, it is a perfect script. And I write in the book that certainly John Michael Hayes' best script for Hitchcock, and that's saying a lot, because that's a golden period. In a different mood, I vastly prefer North by Northwest, just because I like that kind of Kafkaesque black comedy. That's a meta movie too, making fun of movies
Sure.
and making fun of the audience going along and watching this movie, with the actors themselves commenting in scenes on the roles they themselves are playing, right down to at the end, oh, that's not very fair, using real bullets.
Now, you make a compelling case.
That's a sense of humor that appeals to me, very Hitchcockian. I like it. It's a different mood for him too. And Psycho's I'm not sure I think that little explanation at the end is bad. I think it's funny. The movie is very dark, very humorous, very frightening. A pretty perfect script, I think, but a totally different mood. You have to be in a mood to watch Psycho.
Well, you don't have to convince me, brother. Like, I'll
Yeah.
watch it. It doesn't have to be Halloween season. It's right up there for me. So, but the thing that elevates, I think, Rear Window slightly above North by Northwest, just to get back to that point, is its thematic richness. I'm not throwing North by Northwest under the bus. It's just that Rear Window is so infinitely delicious in terms of breaking it down and figuring out what makes it tick. What is the movie about? It's a more about movie to me than some of the other Hitchcocks. But to each his own. There's no wrong answer here. But the casting in particular, you touched on this earlier, is crucial, right? So you mentioned, Hitchcock's talking to his collaborators, a screenwriter, for example, and he's going to play this and she's going to play. So did he have those people in mind even before he asked them to be in the cast?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
In fact, he met John Michael Hayes on the set of Dial M for Murder, and he was already besotted with Grace Kelly.
Now, they had already worked in Dial M for Murder right before this, right?
Yes.
That was preceding this.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think they made 3 pictures together.
So he had already, of course, she looked ideal, and that was helpful.
Yeah.
But he also found her to be playful, flirtatious, risque.
Oh, absolutely.
Funny body, very, very collaborative with him, and not any trouble at all as an actress, whatever that might mean. And so he immediately, decided, well, he had to put her in a movie that she could show off all of her colors, and he would make her more beautiful than she ever would be. And she's really, really beautiful actress. This is the movie where she's the most beautiful.
Luminous.
He did
Yes.
make her the most beautiful. He gives her a magical entrance. I write in my book of when she leans down over the camera to kiss Jimmy Stewart awake, and he does it in a slow motion, shimmering the camera.
You got it.
It's a wonderful thing. So he knew he wanted to showcase her. That's the right word.
Right.
Now he was making films alternately with Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant, and it's odd because, obviously Cary Grant's enormously romantic figure, but this is a very romantic movie for Jimmy Stewart, even though he doesn't quite buy the goods, throughout the whole movie. He's clearly in love with her and pained by it, He gets far more pained in Vertigo. But Jimmy Stewart was a lot easier to work with because he worked with Hitchcock as a partner. They worked financially as partners. I think I write in my book, that working with Cary Grant could be a pain because he was really fussy about everything. And he really had to be like coaxed and nurtured. And you had to get him to the set, and once you got him to the set through the proper contract and the proper courtship of the project, etc., then he behaved amazingly and he was a wonderful actor. Jimmy Stewart, you shook his hand, he put his sandwich in his lunch pail, and then he took his lunch pail to work, and then he sat down, and then he did the scene, and then he did it again if you wanted it again.
Right. He's the perfect everyman. I mean, he looks the part, he plays the part, but here he interestingly plays a bit against type here because he's established as a likable guy screen persona in the 30s and 40s, but he's starting to reveal a darker side by the late 40s, and Hitchcock capitalizes on the actor's range, I believe.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad he didn't cast somebody like Cary Grant in the part.
He takes Jimmy Stewart to great places in the cinema when Jimmy Stewart's getting ready after World War II, when Jimmy Stewart's ready to do that, starting with Rope, which is an extraordinary film and an extraordinary role for Jimmy Stewart to be playing, and then climaxing with Vertigo, so they had a really spectacular working relationship. And Hitchcock, he's moving all these pieces around in the 1950s really brilliantly. He's at his height, and he knows after this he's going to do To Catch a Thief with Grace Kelly and Cary Grant. So he's alternating them. Could it have been Cary Grant? I don't know. There's something quintessentially American about that Greenwich Village courtyard, that would have been disturbed by Cary Grant's irony and self-regard, that he never dropped.
Right.
Even though he had a kind of wounded persona in some ways, he was also royalty. One of the things I love about the movie that people don't necessarily pick up on, and it's one of these aspects of its denseness and richness that you're referring to, is that it's Hitchcock at a very populist, generous stage. When he looks across into the windows of all these people, he's rooting for everybody in those windows that he's looking through.
Yeah, he's not condescending or looking his nose down on anyone. I don't feel that.
He's showing us a humanity that he likes, and I think it's Truffaut asks him at the end of their interviews, in this film, aren't you showing the weakness of humanity, but the humanity that you are rooting for, that is just trying to find some happiness? And Hitchcock says, definitely. Now, I don't know if they understood each other. Later on, Peter Bogdanovich came along and he said, well, what's going to happen to Jeff and Lisa? What's going to happen to them after the credits? Are they going to get married? And you can just hear Hitchcock snort, and he says, well, Peter, I don't know. I mean, after all, they're fictional people, but, maybe I think he's probably just going to pick up his camera and go back to another war zone.
Yeah. Or else she's going to be having to hide a lot of fashion magazines behind adventure books.
Yeah. It plays with the audiences, it gets very close. Hitchcock had been really affected by a neorealism, and he never makes a realistic picture. But at times he makes a picture that, even though it's highly theatrical, and this film is highly theatrical because it's completely stylized on a soundstage, there are times when he comes to a very naturalistic, humanistic, and sympathetic view of what he's filming. And it's not often. It's rare in his work, but he does it perfectly here because it was part of him, and the subject matter, and I think the actors allowed him to do that he had the right apparatus, for that kind of vision.
Yeah, even the smaller actors in the windows across the courtyard. But to me, we've already talked about Jimmy Stewart, we've talked Grace Kelly. I think the unsung hero among the thespians here is perhaps Thelma Ritter, because as the candid caretaker, she serves as a pseudo voice of conscience. She gives lines like,
New York state sentence for a peeping Tom is 6 months in the workhouse.
Oh, hello, Scott.
They got no windows in the workhouse. In the old days, they used to put your eyes out with a red-hot poker. Any of those bikini bombshells you're always watching worth a red-hot poker? Oh, dear. We become a race of peeping Toms. What people ought to do is get outside their own house and look in for a change. Yes, sir. How's that for a bit of homespun philosophy?
I love these lines, but I love Thelma Ritter. It's a great little supporting role, and she just sells it wonderfully. So not a huge cast in terms of speaking parts, but I love all the little touches, and I think he nailed it with the entire cast here.
Yeah, and I think honestly, probably Thelma Ritter. Remember, Lisa is not even in the novella. There's no girlfriend. There's no girlfriend. And Jeff is not a photojournalist. He has no occupation. So Hitchcock's doing all of these things. And in the novella, the third character was a black houseman, like a servant. And it was kind of tinged with racism, but you couldn't put your finger on it. So he changed it. And he decided it would be Thelma Ritter. And in conversations with John Michael Hayes made a big contribution to this character because he said, what we need is for that character to be a kind of unifier for the audience. And Hitchcock said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you go into the theater and you sit down and this person's over there doing that and this person's over there doing that. Everybody's disparate, but there needs to be somebody up on the screen that unites them. And Hitchcock said, well, how would you do that? And he said, by humor, by comedy. And so they were speaking the exact same language at that point. Hitchcock loved that. And he said, oh, yes, do that. So all that she has the laugh lines.
That's true.
She's kind of the Greek chorus, she's saying, watch out, watch out. Look out, so it's like she's in the theater, saying the things that are thought bubbles coming out of, characters' heads and things.
Right.
The audience, she unifies the audience. Now, it doesn't need a lot of unification because, as I said, the other two characters are so good and the actors are so good. But she does. I've seen Thelma Ritter in so many things. Of course, she's always great.
Always.
But this character, she's not only great, she's incredibly likable.
When she's off on her Scooby-Doo mistering with Lisa across the courtyard, I mean, it's like, wow, never thought that. Yeah, I never saw that coming the first time I saw Rear Window.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, even poor Raymond Burr, playing a villain, he's kind of in the end like begging for our pity in a way different than Norman Bates. But, why are you watching me?
I argue that it makes him even a little bit sympathetic to the audience. There's a few touches where we actually, I can't speak for you or any other viewer, but where I'm actually thinking, if I'm that guy, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what his wife is saying to him, but maybe he's henpecked for all I know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Maybe she berates him. Maybe he's driven, he's been pushed to the limit somehow.
Well, we do see the early scenes where he's like trying to wait on her hand and foot, and he's obviously being yelled at. He's obviously a villain. He's a wife murderer.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But and he's a totally fictional character, and in fact, he's a composite in some of the things he does of famous murderers that Hitchcock had followed all his career because he loved
read that.
Following famous crimes. But nonetheless, he's a sympathetic. Hitchcock had him made up to look a little bit like David O. Selznick.
That's so funny. Wow, I thought of that, and I didn't know that was true. Okay.
Yeah, and but he in the end, you feel so, even when he comes into the room and he's trying to kill him and he's putting flash bulbs off in his eyes, the guy is so fumbling and bumbling.
I know.
And then of course the ending, I mean the climactic ending is hilarious, because the police come and they get him, but he gets dropped down onto his leg.
Yep.
This is a dark joke, I mean, it's a great story. It makes for a great story. It makes for a great crime story, but it's hilarious,
Absolutely. All right, let's pivot briefly here. I want to talk about ways Rear Window was the first of its kind, perhaps groundbreaking or innovative, or for that matter, influential. So if I can kick off the conversation here, this was the largest and most elaborate, ambitious set Hitchcock or Paramount Studios had ever created, at least up to this point. And it included a full-scale courtyard, the rear facades of the surrounding apartments, replicating an authentic urban environment, of course. And the set measured, I read, approximately 98 feet wide, 185 feet long, 40 feet high. It's a big set with buildings reaching 7 stories tall. This impressive scale enabled the filmmakers to achieve the movie's distinctive visual style and maintain a high level of realism. It's a huge point, the set. Also, Patrick, the extensive use of diegetic sound in Rear Window, with all of the audio originating within the film's environment. it immerses the audience, right? It immerses them in the protagonist's experience, and it enhances the story's realism and immediacy. So there's kind of a backseatism of the score by Franz Waxman, and it's built into the diegetic sounds, which is pretty creative. And I think it allows us to pay more attention to even the smallest sounds, the slightest audio clues or cues that Jeff is trying to pick up. So I really admire that about it. Any thoughts here on how the film was inventive, innovative, or groundbreaking?
Well, I agree. I mean, really, the sound, what he's doing with multiple microphones and lighting, that's also taking place individually in each of these scenes that we're looking across. It's very Altman-esque, it's before Altman, but it's multi-track sound. It's naturalistic because, as you just said, you're listening very carefully for like picking up the noise that we're hearing from a distance. So he's captured the idea of listening from afar. And the audience is listening in from afar. So it's funny because Hitchcock didn't care about sound or dialogue, the way you'd think. But he, from the very beginning, and at the end of the 1920s, he was very innovative with sound. He was very intrigued by what he could do with sound, both in terms of music and soundtracks, and you alluded to Franz Waxman's song, and the many ways in which Lisa is used as a cue for the music and in the soundtrack. And it's very witty, the way the whole soundtrack is composed. And it's, again, I go back to this sort of, he was talking about a pocket universe that shows an index of human behavior, all range of human behavior. So he's trying for that in the sound as well, to give us a sort of naturalistic impression of what it would be like to be in an apartment across from all these other apartments in the courtyard. And that, strangely, doesn't date. In other words, you can watch it today, it's done so well that it doesn't date. You can see it in a film nowadays when people do it, where you have perfect sound, or deliberately bad sound, and scene after scene, and it's going to date next year. It's not going to be good. But his effort to be artistic about it and to be very exact, which these things interested him sometimes more than how did the wife die that Raymond Burr killed,
Yeah, that's almost a MacGuffin, if you will. Like the whole murder mystery is the MacGuffin,
Yeah, that's a simple thing, and it's not challenging to him. But the rest of it, he loved rope, filming a whole thing with certain number of takes in a small confined space. Towards the end of his life, Larry Cohen came to him and said, I have a great idea for a murder mystery set inside a phone booth. Eventually, it was made into a film. And he told him the whole story. And Hitchcock loved it because it was all taking place in a phone booth. So he lifeboat.
He liked to be challenged.
Yeah, so let's tell the whole story from across the courtyard, peeking into the windows of the neighbors. This is it's different than the novella, which has the seeds of this. It has the origin of these ideas, but Hitchcock brought these ideas out, changed them, and he made the ideas, as you say, part of the greatness of the film, even though you can watch that film being completely unaware of the technique and what brilliance of technique it is, and enjoy yourself immensely.
Absolutely. Just getting back to answering the question, especially regarding influential nature of Rear Window. Let's just rattle off, shall we, some of the films that came in its wake from then to now. You have After Rear Window. It's a very different film, but some thematic elements in Peeping Tom is 1960. Wait Until Dark, Audrey Hepburn film where she plays the blind woman, is 1967. The Bride Wore Black, the Truffaut film from 68. Night Watch is 73. Coppola's The Conversation is 1974. Someone's Watching Me, with an exclamation point, is 1978. Foul Play, the Chevy Chase comedy, takes a little bit of riffing on this film in Hitchcock in 78. There's Blowout, the De Palma movie from 81. Body Double, of course, is a huge ripoff of Rear Window and Vertigo, 1984. The Bedroom Window is 87. Sliver, 93. Woody Allen's Manhattan Murder Mystery perhaps takes a cue from Hitchcockian films like Rear Window. That's 93. Abominable is 2006. Disturbia, which is kind of like a modern resetting of a Rear Window scenario, is 2007. Stalked by My Neighbor is 2015. The Woman in the Window, 2021. Getting into recent years here, we have The Voyeurs 2021, Watcher 2022, and Kimi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Kimi, is 2022 as well. Have you seen any of these films, and do they hold a sliver of quality of Rear Window?
Well, some of them are quite good that you mentioned, and actually you appreciate and enjoy, and Hitchcock would too if he were alive, the respect that some of those films show to Rear Window and the fact that they, spin off of it. But I mean, if Eric, if you were doing a similar list and saying, let's look at the movies that were influenced by, Psycho, you'd need a few more hours
Oh,
of
yeah, that's true.
because mostly his technique, people do try to imitate his technique and respect it in various ways, bring it forward into this age. And they might take his ideas from movies and do the same thing. But I think that's a movie that's, like I say, you can see like Disturbia is a pretty good one. The Bedroom Window is a pretty good one. But that's what you're going to say when you're done watching it. That's a pretty good one. You're not necessarily going to watch it a dozen more times in your life.
Yeah.
I hope not.
Exactly. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention, even though it is pretty mediocre, in my opinion, the 1998 TV movie remake starring Christopher Reeve. Did you see that one?
You know what? I have a vague impression of having seen
Okay.
it. But, I don't think these people try to be mediocre. I think they try to be good. But, the thing with Hitchcock and Rear Window is that this is the point you're really making, is that it's original with him. These ideas and this crazy idea to do all of this at the same time in a film is original with him. It's very Hitchcockian. Once he's done it, he doesn't repeat it. He doesn't do Rear Window 2. There's no need for it for him because he's not interested in that kind of career. So when anybody else comes along, it does feel, no matter how good it is, that it's a repeat in various ways, just trying to recreate something that someone else already did that's original and can't be done.
Yeah, he was there 1st.
But I think people try and it's nice and he'd be flattered, but he did it for his own enjoyment. And you can tell, I know from reading my book, sometimes people would say, why don't you like Suspicion better? And I said, well, I really don't because he did it. I know from doing research and doing this kind of book, what film they really like, and that they really chortled throughout the making of, because it was exactly what they were trying to do and it was working. And this is one. They're not all the same, so it's not each one is a masterpiece. And he would probably say none of them are masterpieces, and they all have little things that he'd rather were done better. But this was done as well as he could from what was in his head. And I'm sure he was chortling, but it's original with him. So when someone else comes along, yes, it feels like a replica or a knockoff, that you buy at the market.
Yeah, no, well said. And you mentioned a few moments ago, Robert Altman, for example. I'm going to quote here. This is Jay Hoberman from The Village Voice back in the day. Said that Rear Window reveled in the simultaneity of the 8 million stories in the Naked City, and he credited it as being the slyly alienated precursor of multiple narratives like Shortcuts or Magnolia. So it kind of riffs on what you were saying a moment ago, the different stories, yeah.
Absolutely. And I wrote a biography of Altman, so I know how much he was fascinated by Hitchcock.
Yeah.
By the way, he started out on the Hitchcock TV show in Hollywood. Altman's brilliance was he tries to take somebody's idea and he turns it inside out. So, if Hitchcock was trying to do 7 or 8 different stories with the microphones and the sound and everything, Altman's going to do 48,
Right.
48 stories.
Yeah, maybe more in Nashville. Who knows? There's so many.
And simultaneous, they'll be going on
Yep.
simultaneous while he's cutting. And when it works, it's super brilliant. And again, it's original with him because who else would do such a crazy thing?
Right.
The same with Hitchcock. Who else would do such a crazy thing? I'm sure everybody who heard it, said, really? Is that the film we're going to do now? Well, then they listened to it with his confidence and his sense of humor and everything. But we haven't even gotten to the fact that there were all these censorship, issues at the time.
Sure.
Because there was a Hays Code. And, this set that you're talking about, he would invite the censorship officials over and he'd give them a grand tour of the location. And he'd take them into Jimmy Stewart's apartment and look across the window. Now that's the window where the young girl will be undressing. And you can see how far away that will
Right.
be. he won't be seeing anything of that.
He's been ruminating on this in his head for quite a while, you can tell. Yep.
Right, then he shoots it 3 times. He shoots it once from the back where she's nude, once with black underwear, and once with white underwear, and then he lets them choose.
Okay, funny.
He wants their opinion. Which do you think would work best? So he's yes, he's doing all these things. He's a great juggler.
Right.
So he's juggling not just Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly, having enormous fun juggling them, but he's juggling all these other things. And then he says, "Throw me some more. Throw me something else to juggle."
Yep.
And he's chortling. You can just tell he's chortling. Other movies sometimes, like The Trouble with Harry. You can tell he's chuckling the whole time he's making it. The remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much, you can tell he's feeling not this scene is not so great. Others. So you can tell when he's really, really gleeful. He's gleeful, and he's gleeful. We're saying this in another way when we said it's humanistic. It's a good-humored movie. He's in a good humor, and the audience is in a good humor, and the characters, like Grace Kelly, is thrilled. She's detecting a murder.
Yeah, you could tell that he's in his glory making this film. And this is a good segue. So I wanted to ask you what you admire about Hitchcock's directing choices in Rear Window. Is he doing anything notable, different, or unique in this picture that he maybe had not done in his films before or after? For example, we can point to how the entire film, for the most part, is shown from Jeff's point of view. And consequently, I think we identify with Jeff. He's immobile, and except for a few shots, we only see and hear what he sees and hears, and that makes us complicit in his voyeurism, which is crucial to really appreciating Rear Window. Even though what Jeff is doing, it's morally wrong. It's against the law to some extent, too, which makes him perhaps a less than admirable character. Even though this is happening, he still earns our undivided attention, and he serves as a reliable, identifiable audience surrogate. So the POV here, is this unique for Hitchcock in any way that he had not done before, simply because we have a captive protagonist?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say it is unique, or let's put it this way, it's the best example in his work of the captive protagonist, the captive audience, and the POV. Most people watch the movie and they don't even know that because they're just watching a really, really interesting story with charming people who you like to see on the screen. About 1 minute after you're introduced to them, you want them to come back onto the screen. So yes, it's all of those things. Is it cinematically radical or innovative? If you're interested in, editing and in editing ideas and editing montage, and Hitchcock he was a fan of the Soviets in the 1920s when he was in London, and he would go to film club.
That's right. Kuleshov's theories on how editing shapes perception. Yeah.
And there are interviews where he will explicate Kuleshov's theory. So this film is a masterclass in Kuleshov's editing theories.
We should really quickly, for our listeners, just explain that. So Kuleshov was this Russian film theorist, right? He illustrated that an actor's neutral expression could convey various emotions depending on the juxtaposed images. By alternating between shots of what Stewart sees or thinks he sees and his reactions, Hitchcock involves the audience in Stewart's voyeurism and emotional experience, thereby transforming them into active participants in the story.
And remember, it's all being put together in Hitchcock's mind long before it's shot, and then it's not shot sequentially. They're not saying, Jimmy, now you look through the binoculars at this nude woman, and now let's see the nude woman. Now let's shoot the nude woman scene. Now, Jimmy, let's see your reaction. No, they're all going along with the joke.
Right.
Jimmy Stewart's performance is particularly admirable and particularly wonderful, considering the way I'm describing it to you, that he's performing the job and the Kuleshov of like reacting to things that he can't see, literally. And then he just knows it from the script and from what Hitchcock tells him he's looking at. Now, sometimes they're doing that. I mean, sometimes they're looking across the courtyard at the image because they're filming it. But at that point, they're usually not filming Jimmy Stewart. So it's a brilliant editing masterclass. And that's why, filmmakers might prefer Vertigo for its deep themes, but they don't prefer it for its special effects, even though its special effects are quite good for the time.
Oh, I agree.
But Rear Window is a masterclass in making a film out of edited ideas.
Yes, well said.
And Hitchcock loved edited ideas. He loved the shocking scream close up of a woman's face and then cut to what either she sees or what the audience sees or what we are allowed to see. And he's throughout Rear Window is only showing us what we are allowed to see in snippets as the story progresses, and not just the main story, but the story of the depressed woman without a
Miss
date
Lonely Hearts,
and the sexy woman limbering up.
Miss Torso, yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Russell. And so he's bringing us along on all of these stories in a very Kuleshov masterclass kind of way. And because he's so good at it and knows how to do it, that's why filmmakers, probably no filmmaker alive who isn't film conscious, who doesn't think this is a great film, because there's so much editing technique and ideas.
But also, on the heels of that, Rear Window capably demonstrates Hitchcock's great talent for audience manipulation. We've already talked about this, making Thorwald, for example, a slightly sympathetic villain.
Yeah.
As in 3 of his earlier films, you already mentioned, Rope, Lifeboat, maybe Dial M for Murder to some extent. The director confines the narrative primarily to a single set or location, in this case, Jeff's apartment. But unlike those films, he isn't afraid to break this rule here by bringing the camera outside the apartment and presenting closer shots of surrounding characters. Like, for example, when the dog owner chastises her neighbors after the pet is found dead, or the close-up flashes of the neighbors we observe looking up at Jeff and Thorwald tussling. So some really interesting things in terms of what he's doing perhaps a little differently from other films. You mentioned the slow-mo kiss. I think it's really cool. He was already famous for memorable, protracted, stylized kissing scenes between male and female leads in his films. And that's evidenced in, for example, Notorious, the protracted kissing scene, or Dial M for Murder. Here, you laid it out. He gives us this dreamy, sensual, slow-motion osculation between Kelly and Stewart. And the execution, we can agree, it's brilliant. And we first see Jeff, let's just break it down, right? So he's sleeping in his chair next to the window. This shadow engulfs his face, remember? And the camera cuts to this encroaching figure. It's Lisa. She's radiantly adorned as she looks and smiles directly at the camera. She comes closer, and her approaching presence and overwhelming shadow seem to awaken Jeff. And then she leans in for that sultry slow-mo smooch in which those full puckered lips punctuate the nighttime silence. Again, it's just brilliant the way that he executes that scene. And he's doing it in about 30 seconds. I mean,
yeah.
You could argue it's a throwaway thing that has nothing to do with the plot, or why should we care? Because the camera loves Grace Kelly. And because Hitchcock, he knows how to make these otherwise forgettable scenes completely memorable.
Well, and it's followed by her taking her negligee out of her traveling case. And it's clear she's going to stay overnight.
Preview of coming attractions.
Yeah, and it's so cleverly scripted that Jimmy Stewart is rolling his eyes like he didn't want this babe, to stay overnight and nurse him.
Again, what's wrong with this guy?
This is one of the things that keeps the film modern, even though many ways it's classic. So old-fashioned / classic, but it's modern. Audiences see it and they know what's going on. It got past the censors. It's so modern. You see people doing I just was watching Havana with Robert Redford in bed with 2 women, and Robert Redford's usually good in the film. Sidney Pollack's usually pretty good.
Because that's kind of like that Casablanca knockoff film, right? I never saw it.
Yeah, so they're trying for something like that, but it kind of fails the magic test, and it doesn't seem modern. It seems hokey, This seems modern. It's romantic, it's idealized, it's beautiful, it's magical, but it also seems modern, partly because he has it integrated with what comes next. She takes her negligee out, planning to stay the night, and she stays the night. We know from later on in the movie that she has stayed the night. It's like that's one of the things that keeps North by Northwest modern, that they stay the night together in the train. And it's clear to everybody except the censors and the priests who don't go to see the movies, that this is what happened. And it makes it modern because suddenly something real slips into this staged theatrical thing that Hitchcock has set up. And he knows that.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt to have the choo-choo running through the tunnel, suggestively,
Yeah,
right?
Right.
This has been called maybe Hitchcock's best expression of pure cinema. I want to get your definition of what that means, pure cinema, and can you provide examples within Rear Window?
Well, I think it would be fair to call it one of the best examples of pure cinema. Pure cinema is Norman Lloyd falling off the Statue of Liberty,
Saboteur, yeah.
done in a special effects shot. So or the carousel exploding in Strangers on a Train, and it's done in this like kaleidoscopic montage too. It's tremendous stagecraft performing some incredible visual feat, in front of the audience. That's what it is. But this whole film is that. Like I said, it can be watched without audiences even realizing that because it's done in a very naturalistic, low key, understated way throughout that draws you in and puts you in the position of being Jimmy Stewart and sitting in that chair. And it's pure cinema, and it's taking these ideas of voyeurism and of watching people from afar that's we know is naughty, but we are really tempted to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings you into all these cinematic ideas and then does it with technique that's impeccable.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. I mean, I think Lifeboat is too, and so is Rope.
But there's a lot more dialogue in those films. Here, there is dialogue,
Yeah.
but I think he conveys a lot more expressively with pure visuals than words.
Yeah. I don't think you could do it without words, but he doesn't need a lot of words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So absolutely, it sounds like we're on the same page. This could be the purest pure cinema Hitchcock has done.
Well, maybe that's why people rate it so highly,
Yeah.
because it certainly is pure cinema, and it is also the most enjoyable without being terrifying or
Mm-hmm.
upsetting or disturbing.
Yeah.
It's none of those things.
No, it's true.
If we dwelled on what Raymond Burr was actually doing, we might be a little disturbed.
Therein is the advantage of the separation. We got a courtyard between us and the horror over there. Absolutely. So it's the 70th birthday month for Rear Window. Birthdays are a time for giving presents. That's what our show is all about, Cineversary. Only it's movie lovers who continue to receive the gifts. So what is Rear Window's greatest gift to viewers, Patrick?
Well, we were talking about it earlier. I think it's something that very few films have, which is even though we say, this is a great film and I'd love to see it again, blah, blah, blah. There's not a lot of films, like if you were to take 1954, there aren't a lot of films that have immortality and will be around another 50 years from now. People saying this is a great film, let's go see it. It's still going to be a great film, and people will still want to see it because it has all of these qualities that we're talking about that make it both entertaining and rich and textured and dense with ideas.
True. Yeah, I love it. That's a wonderful answer. Okay, here's my take. As far as the greatest gift, there are many valuable presents we can point to, but I'm enamored of two in particular, Patrick. One, this has got to be the finest film ever created about the allure and dangers of voyeurism and the slippery slope that starts with relatively harmless, distanced observing, but can quickly devolve into active spying, surveillance of privacy rights violated human beings. It's a cautionary tale in some ways. Just because Jeff's suspicions about his shady neighbor prove correct doesn't mean his methods for outing the evil are ethically acceptable. So herein lies the conundrum for the viewer, if you so choose to look at it morally. Hitchcock cleverly implicates every viewer watching Jeff, watching others, by making us as intrigued as Jeff and forgiving of his actions, including using binoculars, using the telephoto lens, the telephone, anonymous notes, vulnerable trespassing surrogates like Lisa and Stella. And you recall as well how even though he correctly recruits his detective friend to investigate, he's encouraging violating constitutional rights, foregoing a search warrant, if you remember. There have been countless classics that have creatively explored voyeuristic themes and plots. I think of Blowout, Blue Velvet, Peeping Tom, The Conversation, Blow Up, The Truman Show, The Lives of Others, 1 Hour Photo. But Rear Window, to me, tops them all. And that's because Hitchcock knows how to best manipulate his audience and make them complicit in this spying, as well as tolerant of a sympathetic yet a deviant protagonist. So the second greatest gift, in a nutshell, the movie's all about sex, and more sex to me.
Yeah, right.
It is romantic. I agree with you. There's a lot of expression of love and romance to some degree, but sex, healthy, normal, and society-approved sex as practiced by the newlyweds, exhibitionist titillation evoked by Miss Torso, disturbing assault perpetrated upon Miss Lonely Hearts, if you remember the lascivious younger date scene.
Yeah.
A cautionary reminder that violence often accompanies sex.
Yeah.
And urbane seductiveness in the irresistible form of Lisa, who can fuel desire even with a tiny gesture of her pinky. Perhaps the most sensual shot in the film is not the lean-in kiss to me when, she awakens Jeff. We broke that scene down. But later, Patrick, when the camera hovers across the courtyard, it flits from the half-naked composer's window to a presumably nude Miss Torso brushing her hair, and then it goes past the drawn shade of the newlyweds' bedroom and quickly over to Jeff and Lisa. And what are they doing? Well, they're embraced in a hot and heavy makeout session. And of all the suggestive portals in this scene or any others in the film, you've got a lusty camera that stops channel surfing for a moment and finally and quickly lands upon the epicenter of eroticism in this entire community. It's Jeff's own window. So I just find it so interesting every time I see that scene. It turns out the most interesting people of all to spy on are the voyeurs themselves, one of whom wants to focus on healthy sex in the here and now, and the preoccupied other one who gets his kicks from watching strangers and living dangerously. It's a rumination on sex, and I think a really clever one.
I agree, it is. I agree. And Hitchcock's in favor of both things, by the way, voyeurism and sex.
Yeah, he reveals a lot in his movies, and he's winking at us too, so that's part of the fun. So, Patrick, what are you currently working on that listeners should know about? Is there an upcoming book that you'd like to mention?
I'm finishing a book about Woody Allen. It's coming out next year from HarperCollins. They're also the publisher of the Hitchcock books. So I've been with them for a long time. And it's a biography. It's a traditional biography like the Hitchcock one, going all through his life and career and everything.
Soup to nuts.
And including, he has a few very Hitchcockian films. The most recent one is Coup de Chance, is very Hitchcockian.
Yeah, Match Point is a good one. Mm-hmm.
Match Point's the famous one. It's really good.
Absolutely. Wow, we'll be looking forward to that.
There's a scene in the book where he meets Hitchcock, by the way.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And this really happened, or are you doing some kind of fictionalized?
It really happened. It really happened.
Oh, well, that's fun. Something absolutely to look forward to. Or anything else that should be on our radar?
No, that's it. That's keeping me busy.
Keeping you busy. Well, Patrick, I so enjoyed our conversation. I really appreciate you being able to take the scenic route with us in our exploration of Rear Window, one of our shared favorite films and Hitchcock classics. Thanks again for appearing on Cineversary.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Yes, indeed. Mr. McGilligan definitely brought the goods. Nice chat there with Patrick, whose insights and facts about Hitchcock and Rear Window we greatly appreciate. Now, we say hello to distinguished guest number 2. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show a longtime film critic, co-host of the fantastic Film Spotting podcast, and author of Movies Are Prayers, as well as Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror. It's Josh Larsen. Josh, we've previously been joined by 2 of your Film Spotting brethren, Adam Kempenaar and Michael Wilmington. We are so thrilled that you completed the trifecta. Welcome to Cineversary.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I'm glad I could be here, and wanted to do it for a while, but when you brought up Rear Window, I knew I could not resist the invitation.
Irresistible. Yes, indeed, sir. It's a shared favorite among both of ours. It's not my favorite film of all time. I think it's my number 3 Hitchcock, in fact. It's pretty hard to rank them, in my opinion, but yeah, I'd go Vertigo, Psycho, then Rear Window. But again, they're very, very close. It's not like this is a distant third, if you will.
For sure.
So it's almost a photo finish for me in my book. But I am eager to hear your take because, again, you have professed on your show that this ranks as not only Hitchcock's best film, but your favorite movie of all time. So can you recall, Josh, your initial watch of Rear Window? Maybe how old you were, where you were, what you thought of the film at first, and for that matter, how your opinion of Rear Window has grown and evolved.
Ooh, that's a great question that I wish I had an obvious answer for. I watched so much Hitchcock when I was very young because here in the Chicago area, WGN would hold Hitchcock marathons.
Yes. I'm a little older than you, but I do recall getting my first exposure, for example, to North by Northwest on WGN and a few others. But I don't recall the marathons. That's pretty cool. Maybe that was like when I was a little older.
Yeah, I think it was maybe more of a series, something like that, where it would be, maybe it was like Sunday nights or something. It was a recurring thing enough that it helped me to become aware. And I'm talking, maybe 8, 9, 10, something like that, to become aware of the director, that there was someone who put their stamp on a variety of movies, and you could trace common themes and ways of making movies and actors in some cases.
Yeah.
And so that series was really my entry to even thinking about movies in this way. And of course, in some cases, maybe inappropriate for me to be watching that young. I write in Fear Not, Christian Appreciation of Horror Movies, about encountering Psycho on TV way too young. And these are edited versions, of course, but even so, some disturbing material. And all that to say, I don't have a distinct memory as I do of Psycho of seeing Rear Window as part of
Mm.
that series. For some
Okay.
reason, it wasn't included, perhaps. I may have come to Rear Window a little bit later, whether on DVD or
Mm-hmm.
in a theatrical re-release type of thing. So I don't think it was one of those very first formative Hitchcocks I saw, but it definitely would have been as I was becoming more of a burgeoning cinephile, teens maybe, or a little bit older,
Sure.
college age, and just starting to track down those classics that I had not yet seen.
Yeah, I can relate because if you were to pinpoint, hey, Eric, when did you first see Rear Window? I don't exactly remember. I think it had to be college age because I was studying some different film classes and took a Hitchcock course and so forth. But it's kind of nebulous. It's amorphous. It's in that area somewhere. So it wasn't
Right.
as a young child. But yeah, but it certainly stuck with me. But yeah, the question of your opinion of the film, how has it evolved, if it has? Like, obviously, your first watch or two, you're just soaking it in, right? You're enjoying the plot. You're intrigued in the mystery and the suspense. But yeah, over time, and I think you can relate, right? Like, I listened to the Film Spotting episode, The Sacred Cow on Rear Window. And yeah, obviously, you're watching it with a different lens today, I would imagine.
For sure. And it goes back to this idea of learning how to watch movies. The great thing about Rear Window is it is such an entertainment. So you do have that initial experience where, the actors are compelling, these iconic personalities, the story is suspenseful.
Mm-hmm.
But every time I revisit it, I'll find something else to notice. And a lot of it is just visually the amount of information Hitchcock is packing into the frame, because as we might get into, this is a movie of multiple frames. We have, the window that we're mostly looking out of here when we're sitting in LB Jeffries' apartment. And then we have all the windows of the other apartments that we can look into. So there's so much to keep track of.
Mm.
And I think that lends itself to being a movie that is worth repeat viewing. So I started to appreciate those sorts of things, but also, again, how it reflected other concerns of Hitchcock that I've since noticed being through lines, the more movies of his I've seen. Things like, how does James Stewart present himself here compared to in Vertigo, still working with the same director? So stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the meta element of this, how much this reveals itself to be a movie about watching movies.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's something that doesn't, strike your mind the first time you watch it, but as you get deeper into it, you see, oh, this is going on as well. So I think it's just, and this is what happens with these movies that rise to the top and we can say are among our favorite of all time, are the ones that keep giving us more with each return visit.
Yeah, well said. Now, I'm curious how often you revisit. Is this like some people will go back to the well on their favorite movie or top 10 once a year, or, maybe there's an anniversary date or something like that. I'm just curious how often you will rewatch Rear Window.
Yeah, I really need to have a reason. It's not so much the anniversary thing with as many movies as I want to watch that are new releases, or for other Sacred Cows we're doing on Film Spotting, or research for other projects. I don't really have a lot of open time to watch stuff without some sort of impetus.
Mm.
So if I'm looking on Letterboxd now, within the last 8 years, it looks like I've watched it twice.
Yeah.
So that's probably a fair indication of, every 5 to 10 years, I bet I've watched it. But if there's a project where I need to, then I'll throw it on for that reason as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar. Maybe every 4 to 8 years thereabouts. It's pretty close. And usually I've found the last maybe 3 watches have been introducing the movie to a younger generation. Obviously my kids are older now, but this recent week, this was a good invitation to invite my younger nephews, 14 years old, to watch maybe their second Hitchcock movie and just kind of open their eyes to, hey, there's more than just Psycho and some of the horror stuff like The Birds, which they love, but yeah, some deeper kind of themes to explore. So it's a good opportunity to, you know, open some younger eyes to the wonders of Hitchcock. And it's a great gateway drug to Hitchcock to me. Like, it's the perfect movie to introduce, especially a younger viewer, to Hitchcock, because it is problematic if you want to dig deeper, but I don't think they're really paying attention to that like they would in maybe Psycho or Vertigo. Here, you pay really close attention on first watch to the plot.
For sure. And it's funny you say that. As you were talking, I'm looking up on Letterboxd when I have actually logged Rear Window, and I see here the 2016 watch that I did. I said, just scared the crap out of the kids with this, their first Hitchcock. So there you go. And
well, that's good news if it's actually still that effective to viewers 7 years later. And again, age is relative. Like a much younger viewer, of course, would maybe be more startled by some of the elements here, but maybe older viewers a little more jaded and scare me, I dare you, kind of a thing. But yeah,
sure.
That's good to hear that Hitchcock is still effective.
Yeah, I think if I'm doing quick math here, they would maybe have been around, I don't know, 10 and 13, 11, 14, something like that.
That's a good age for Rear Window. Yeah, absolutely. So in the Film Spotting Madness tournament earlier this year, Rear Window was voted the best movie of the 1950s, the entire decade. Did this top ranking surprise you, Josh? Or does it speak to the universality of this picture and how it could be Hitchcock's most embraced, most accessible, maybe most revisited work, essentially the popular favorite among his filmography?
I think it did surprise me. And I'm trying to remember, you know, those of us on the show do a bracket, a predictions bracket. We do one with all the listeners as well, but we have sort of a competition with those of us on the show. And I'm trying to remember if I predicted Vertigo going further than Rear Window. That can be a fool's errand trying to predict that bracket.
I threw all my money behind Seven Samurai, and
did you?
Up until the last round of I was doing pretty good, but it was a long shot. I know
it had a good run. It
It did.
I think in my memory and even my logic now is I thought Vertigo would take it. Vertigo had a bit more of the, critical cachet. I mean,
sure.
Vertigo
Sight and
was
Sound number 1, number 2. Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So you've got that behind it, but it turned out, listeners preferred Rear Window. And that was a question. The episode we did was Rear Window versus Vertigo, trying to force ourselves to make that choice. Rear Window had been my default answer, but never because I had actually held them up side by side before. It was just the one that I'd probably seen more often and had more affection for. And I came out of that experiment, to your point about your ranking of Hitchcock films. I mean, these are very, very close. But I did come out feeling pretty strongly that I thought Rear Window was, for whatever this is worth, a better overall Hitchcock film. And turned out, most listeners voting in Film Spotting Madness felt the same way. So it was a little bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, I agree. Like when the first brackets were announced, I thought, well, come on, it's got to be Vertigo, right? Not just the best Hitchcock picture, but the best movie of the decade. Just like you said, for the critical acclaim, for all the buzz over the years, AFI listing, not just Sight and Sound, etc. But, as I listened to the brackets unfold on your episodes, and I dug back into Rear Window, it makes sense. I respect it. I think it's a popular favorite, right? Even though it's really hard to quantify critical kind of kudos to a movie or assign, for example, the Rotten Tomato ratings versus IMDb versus whatever. This is so subjective and, just your own opinion, et cetera. And there's no wrong answer, of course, folks. But I admit, I agree. Yeah, I was kind of surprised.
Yeah. And, the thing for me, too, is it wasn't a matter of Vertigo necessarily lacking anything. You're comparing films that both people have described both as perfect films, right?
Right.
And so it just came down to Vertigo. One of the things that I felt was a little bit missing that is pure Hitchcock is the audience's complicity. So I think Hitchcock is so good at making us feel guilty for sympathizing or empathizing with his characters who get involved in, a lot of bad stuff quite frequently.
Right.
And I just love that element of his filmmaking. And it is so crucial to Rear Window that we are the voyeurs as well here.
Exactly.
And maybe posing as, just as Jeffries and Lisa are posing as the heroes, but still we're the voyeurs as well. And I love that element of it. And I don't know if you empathize with Scotty quite as much in Vertigo. And again, that's not a flaw in the film. It's just a different facet that I don't find to be there as strongly as it is in other Hitchcocks.
Yeah, that's an interesting element, putting yourself in not only the director's shoes, but like thinking about how the audience is being manipulated so cleverly by the filmmaker. So yeah, you can appreciate it on so many different levels. I agree. And you use the term pure cinema. And I think this is his greatest expression of pure cinema, because there are a lot of, unspoken, nonverbal, purely visual stretches in Vertigo and other Hitchcock films. But I think of Rear Window first when I think of pure cinema, when I think of images doing the talking, really conveying the messages and the ideas, and forcing us to kind of do things without exposition, dialogue, words, in a really creative way. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different elements to explore. How is Rear Window, Josh? How is it unique and distinctive among the director's works for you? We've already kind of touched on this a little bit. Maybe we can expand. But yeah, and what is Hitchcock doing exactly in Rear Window that impresses you?
I think for me, what's distinctive about it is he pushes to the limit something that he often does in his filmmaking, and that is to put himself in a box with restrictions.
Kind of like how he did in Rope, for example?
Exactly. Yeah, that's maybe the most extreme version, right?
Well, actually, Lifeboat is pretty extreme too, right?
That's true. That's true. So this is already a pattern, but I think the way Rear Window is distinct is just the limitations that he has and the way he is able to surpass them.
Right.
In some of those other instances, they're not quite as successful, I would say. He's not quite as successful in getting out of the box. Here, he does a grand somersault out of this box that he has created, forcing himself to restrict the camera to the apartment, to Jeffrey's apartment, keeping all of the supporting players in their own apartments. They rarely come out.
Yeah, we don't go into their apartments either, right?
Exactly.
We stay pretty much subjective with Jeff's POV. Mm-hmm.
So to your point about pure cinema is that it's relying on image. It's not relying on dialogue. Every once in a while we'll overhear something through the windows, but really we have to go by what we see them doing. And then you think about how Hitchcock uses this to his advantage and the framing here. I brought this up on our review on Film Spotting, but that one shot of the Thorwald's apartment across the way from Jeffrey's, and we can see into their apartment with two windows, right? There's one room we can see in the left window, and then we can see their bedroom in the right window.
Correct.
And the way he goes back and forth in how I'm going to use those limited opportunities. There's a shot where Lars Thorwald is in the room on the left, and we see Mrs. Thorwald in bed on the right. And that separates them, starts to establish their relationship. Sometimes Hitchcock will pan from one window to another to emphasize suspense. So again, you would think telling someone, okay, you have to tell this story about a potential murder, but you can only tell it by looking at this apartment from across the way, and we can only see in these two windows. You'd think, well, that's impossible. Like, this is going to be the most boring thing in the world. And instead, he finds ways. Think of the most iconic image. Thorwald smoking in the dark.
Right.
We just see a dark frame, their window.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden we see the glow from his cigar. How threatening and terrifying that is, working within this restriction. So I think that's what's so unique about Rear Window is Hitchcock getting out of that box he's put himself in so brilliantly.
Yeah, that's a good call. Absolutely. Can't argue with anything you said. I think also what you touched on just a bit ago, what really impresses me about Hitchcock's decisions here is the director, his ability to ingeniously force us to identify with Jeff. This is a man clearly breaking the law, clearly violating society's code of ethics by spying on others. But we, like him, want to learn more about the private lives of these neighbors, even though this is considered immoral behavior by most. But by presenting Jeff as this injured and immobile captive spectator who's snooping and whose suspicions of Thorwald prove correct, it kind of makes him a hero of sorts. Hitchcock not only skirts the censors of this era who would have required Jeff to be punished for these voyeuristic sins, But he also makes this character a likable protagonist we can root for today. It is interesting, though, Josh, if you think about it, how Jeff is punished in a way by ending up with 2 broken legs by the conclusion. Now,
Yes.
I'm curious if that, I never read the original story by Cornell Woolrich, or if there were different iterations of the draft. I have no idea. But I wonder if that was kind of a censorship deference to them. What's your hunch?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It sounds to me like a little bit more of Hitchcock's wicked wit going on there. And because, none of his main characters are really out and out heroes. And I think as likable as James Stewart is here and how we do, sympathize with his situation and also his instincts. Sure. Let's face it, as Thelma Ritter says, as his nurse, we've become a race of peeping Toms, and that includes us. So we sympathize and empathize with that. But also, we do not empathize with the way he is handling his relationship with Lisa, played by Grace Kelly, or the way he even talks to her, that puts us on edge. So yeah, along with the ethical quandaries, it's a way for us to be in tension with LB Jeffries and sort of feel like, I think you're right, like when his other leg is broken at the end, it's a dark joke and also a punishment that feels right. And maybe going back to this idea of our complicity, we want that to happen because, we feel like, we deserve maybe a little more time in the chair too for being voyeurs throughout this movie.
And also maybe he needs to be a little more humbled and appreciative of Lisa.
Yes.
And of course the great final shot with her, kind of sneaking the fashion magazine behind the adventure book is so great.
Yes.
But Jeff, whatever you think about him, I think most people would agree it's pretty immoral what he's doing. But again, if he doesn't do what he's doing, this guy gets away with murder.
True.
So that's what I meant by he is turned into a hero, and we're rooting for him to be correct.
Yeah.
But in the process of doing so, you got to ask yourself, okay, how do you feel about that morally, right?
For sure.
The whole rear window ethics argument they have.
I wonder if it's ethical to watch a man with binoculars and a long focus lens. Do you suppose it's ethical even if you prove that he didn't commit a crime?
I'm not much on rear window ethics.
Of course, they can do the same thing to me, watch me like a bug under a glass if they want to.
Yes. And this comes up in the sequences with Miss Lonely Hearts, a woman who they're spying on and it appears is on the verge of committing suicide. They are watching this. All 3 of them are watching this, Lisa and Thelma Ritter's nurse as well. And then they get distracted by the Thorwalds and the camera pulls away from Miss Lonely Hearts just before that moment. And that is, I think it's a test for us as viewers. Are we going to also be easily distracted and forget about her? Or are we going to sit there and shout at the screen, bring the camera back, go or go say something to Miss Lonely Hearts, right?
Yeah.
I think, for me, that's the real moral crux here is that sequence. And then she's, I believe if I'm remembering correctly, she's distracted by some music.
The song. It almost inspires her to stop the suicide attempt.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the other neighbor.
Nevertheless, your point is so valid because, again, okay, yeah, Jeff and his crew they're trying to, solve this murder mystery, and that's, of course, important. But more imminently, you've got a woman who is prepared to take her life, and you're keeping your eyes off the prize here, and so again, we're conflicted as an audience. So Hitchcock is doing things really cleverly here to conflict us.
Yeah, for sure. Always holding us in that tension. And I think that's what his best movies do so well.
Sure. No question about it. In terms of what Hitchcock is doing here that impresses me, I reflect on how little music there is in Rear Window, Josh.
Yes.
Mostly we hear diegetic sounds in songs. That means, the characters generate sounds and songs on the radio, for example, or a record player. They can hear them in their own universe. Not a traditional score as you would expect it. So the sound design is superb. It forces us to listen closely to faint, far-off noises, words coming from across the courtyard. You may not pick them up perfectly, but they're just enough to create this really interesting ambiance, audio-wise. Yes, music was written exclusively for the film. You have, the veteran Hollywood composer Franz Waxman, who wove much of his score actually into the sound design to be played as background music heard by the characters. What's your thought on the score and the sound design here? Because I think it's really important. Again, you may expect, especially if you're watching Hitchcock movies chronologically or you were alive in this era, oh, okay, there's going to be a traditional score. Now we have an opening kind of song that Franz Waxman composed. And then you have some musical cues even at the end. So I guess it's bookended by a traditional score. But in between, it's very different.
Yeah, this is maybe a better answer to your question about what is Hitchcock doing differently than he has in his other movies, right?
Sure.
Because we associate Bernard Herrmann with Hitchcock and think of that, how crucial that Psycho score is. Not only a great score on its own, but the way it's employed throughout that movie, those stabbing strings.
Yeah, I think he had not been brought aboard yet. They had not collaborated yet until maybe the next picture or two. I just forget. But so I think this was the last time he used another composer.
Yeah.
For the next 10 years or so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we definitely associate, a composed score with Hitchcock. But here, as you said, using the diegetic sounds, I think it's another way of getting out of the box. It's a box he put himself in, but then it's like, okay, I'm not going to use a score because I don't want to break this sense. There's a reason for that, right? Doesn't want to break the sense of being anywhere other than in this claustrophobic apartment with Lisa and with Jeff.
Yes.
And if all of a sudden a swelling score had come in, that would break that magic. And we'd suddenly know that we're watching a movie. Instead of watching The Neighbors, we'd be watching a movie anytime we heard a traditional score. So I think it's a very smart decision, but it does impose restrictions, right? Because scores often will indicate how we're supposed to feel about a scene. When are things getting tense? When are things getting romantic? That would all have been helpful in Rear Window, but no, instead, he's going to find his way out of it. And we just talked about one example with Miss Lonely Hearts, having the music that distracts her and kind of reorients her thinking come from the composer neighbor or the musician neighbor.
So yeah, great points about the score there. And we're patterned to listen more intently for the slightest little cue or clue, a scream, a dog's bark.
Yes.
The kids playing in the street across the way, or something that might indicate something is amiss that might tie into the murder mystery. So yeah, if you interrupt that with proper score music, you're undercutting your purpose here. So I totally agree.
Yeah. And, as you're describing those other sounds beyond just, musical bits that come in, it reminds me that makes me think that this is one of those movies you scour like no other for visual and auditory information, because it is a mystery. You want those clues. It's sort of one of the fun things about not watching it every, 4 to 8 years or whatever is I remember at this point, this doesn't really happen, but I remember years ago when I would revisit it for the second or maybe even third time, not being sure if Thorwald was guilty. And so I would do that scouring again that I did in the first watch. And those are all clues. The dog barking you mentioned,
right?
The cars out on the street that are stopping. Is that going to be the police? Is it someone else? You're just scouring this movie looking for any sort of confirmation of whatever theory you've developed about the Thorwalds.
It sounds like you're similar to me, where it's not like I do this intentionally, where I deliberately don't watch a movie for a number of years because I don't want to oversaturate myself to it, get sick of it, in other words. But I can only testify for myself. It's a function of getting older too. You sometimes forget, like, okay, wait, how does this resolve? Was he guilty? Like, okay, I kind of like that I forget that because I want to be surprised all over again.
Sure.
Now, again, I've probably seen this movie a good 8 to 9 times, and I know the plot inside and out pretty well. I'm not going to forget. But to your point, yeah, it is kind of fun to put something back on the shelf for a while and let it marinate and come back and just rediscover something, even little things that you might forget. So this is a good segue to my next question, Josh. Glad you brought this up because this is a film that is not only infinitely rewatchable, but that rewards repeat viewings with new discoveries. I think we both agree. Can you give an example of something you may have noticed for the first time on your most recent rewatch? And then I'll give you my example.
Yeah, I think I just appreciated this aspect of it. One of the reasons, I've always loved Rear Window is the dynamic between James Stewart and Grace Kelly. And on the most recent watch, it struck me that maybe it's because we have a dearth of rom-coms right now in this era, or good ones, I should say, that this could also be played as a pretty good rom-com where you have the two of them in this relationship that has a point of tension when we meet it. She's more committed than he is, and they're trying to work their way through that.
Yep.
But the dynamic they have and how the mystery sort of is this instigating factor for them to it kind of reignites their relationship in a way, and you wait to see, is it going to bring them closer together? Will it solve their problems? Just great little bits of dialogue, like that opening when they're sort of fighting a little bit, and she says she's going to leave, and he panics and says, when am I going to see you again? And she says, not for a long time, at least not until tomorrow night. Just little bits like that. We think of Rear Window as this tense thriller, which it is.
Yeah.
But because that's in the forefront of my mind, I start watching it again and I'm thinking, well, this is actually kind of a fun rom-com as well, and really sensual. You forget how sensual it is, that famous slow motion profile kiss of she gives to wake him up, and things like that. So yeah, I think those sorts of things always surprise me anew, because it's the suspense that sticks in my mind.
Yeah, there's a great essay I read by alternate ending blogger Tim Brayton, maybe, where he did equate this to a take on a rom-com. So yeah, I've heard other people mention it in that way. And it is a fun way to approach it. I don't think it detracts from the suspense, mystery, thriller angle of it at all, because as we're going to talk about in a moment with themes, I think what you're hitting on here is really, really important. But let's shelve it just briefly. And I just want to throw in what I paid more attention to on the most recent rewatch.
Sure.
So a small item that clicked for me, Josh, was the shot where Lisa is apprehended by the police in Thorwald's apartment, you recall. And behind her back, what does she do? She covertly points to Mrs. Thorwald's ring on her finger, which is this great nonverbal visual clue, but it also comes with a subtextual reading that didn't really dawn on me before. I mean, it's like hiding in plain sight, as they say. It's as if Lisa is pointing at her finger and saying, hey, Jeff, remember this? When am I going to get my wedding ring? And what's the holdup, right?
Yeah.
Which plays into what I believe is among the major themes of the film, as I said, we'll discuss in a moment. The second thing that really struck me is as we see Jimmy Stewart wait for Thorwald to approach, and he's panicking and he's thinking, what am I going to do? Well, a plausible thing I'm thinking is, Jesus, just call the cops right now. What are you waiting for? So that was a little bit of a plot hole that I guess I didn't really think about before. But the actual point I wanted to make was that anticipation. You hear him coming up the steps. You hear the approaching footsteps. You see the shadow under the door, kind of a thing. I immediately thought of No Country for Old Men.
Oh, sure.
And especially the scene where Brolin is awaiting Chigurh.
Yeah.
And obviously it plays out differently, right? I mean, there's shotgun involved. Chigurh blows out the keyhole.
Yeah, no flashbulb there.
But again, that anticipation, I'm thinking of the Coen brothers. They had to have taken a cue from this film.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely an influence there. And you can see, I mean, it's sort of a technique that's been used in a lot of films, but it does strike me as, something about the framing and the anticipation and hearing it.
Oh, yeah, I immediately watched it back to back, just those scenes. Like I wanted to compare and contrast, and there are, of course, some major differences, but the setup is pretty close, I have to say.
Yeah, I can picture it for sure.
Yeah. So this is part of the fun of revisiting a film like this, even if you give it a few years, as we said, to marinate. So we have to talk, Josh. Time is fleeting here, and there's so much to discuss about messages, themes, subtexts. What is this movie about? I'm just going to kick it off with something we've already talked about. To me, it's the major message of Rear Window, and that is fear of love and commitment. To me, it's not about, was Mrs. Thorwald killed and disposed of, and how is Lars Thorwald going to be brought to justice? That's all fun plot stuff. But it's really about Jeff's inability to commit. The murder mystery element, you could argue, is the MacGuffin to propel the narrative. It's ultimately not the important takeaway. To me, though, the movie is all about Jeff and Lisa, as you said, learning to coexist, learning to compromise, to not take each other for granted. If you think about Jeff and you break him down, what is he? He's this adventurous, widely traveled photographer. He values his independence. He possesses a cautious, cynical nature. He doubts that he and Lisa would be compatible long-term, and therefore he doesn't reciprocate much affection with her. I'm going to quote the great Roger Ebert here, who said in his review of the film, he is in love with the occupation of photography and becomes completely absorbed in reconstructing the images he has seen through his lens. He wants what he can spy at a distance, not what he can hold in his arms. And then there's Lisa, right? By contrast, she appears deeply in love with Jeff, determined to make their relationship work, and she's willing to step outside of her comfort zone and actively participate in Jeff's pet project here, his investigation, proving what? Proving her dedication, her capability. She evolves from a seemingly superficial character into this, brave, resourceful partner, taking on risky tasks that Jeff cannot perform. So she's a surrogate for him. And this shift, to me, demonstrates her adaptability, her depth, her, moving beyond her initial portrayal as a glamorous socialite. What do you think about this and this dynamic between the two of them?
Yeah, it's definitely a major piece of the film, and I think it's supported. This reading is supported by all of the supporting characters that we have touched on, because most of them represent a different relational stage.
Yes.
So we've talked about Miss Lonely Hearts, right? And how is she the Lisa if Jeff does break up with her? Probably not, because we see, and Lisa even references this, there's also Miss Torso. And there's the great exchange where the men are visiting Miss Torso, and Jeff says something like,
You remember, of course, Miss Torso, the ballet dancer? She's like a queen bee with her pick of the drones.
and Lisa says something about, she's doing a lot of hard
Juggling
work.
wolves, yeah, hardest job.
Oh, I know, because I've been there. Yep. So Miss Torso is in a different stage of relationship. There are newlyweds. They don't get as much screen time, but we do see these newlyweds, right? And so, yeah, I think that reading you're discussing is supported by the fact that we're seeing this reflected, these different phases that Jeff and Lisa maybe were once in or might be in again. And the Thorwalds are part of this.
Oh, yeah.
Like, don't the Thorwalds represent Jeff's greatest fear? That whatever happened between them has led this husband to murder his wife.
Yeah. Or is it possibly a bit of subconscious wish fulfillment and Jeff's yearning to be free of Lisa?
That's the provocative part about, as we were saying, if you forget whether Thorwald is guilty or not, that's the provocative part of that, right? If he's not guilty, it almost makes the psychological element stronger in this case.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great reading. Yeah, you bring up here all these different windows, the channel surfing that Jeff and we do as viewers here. And all of those, different characters, we're just given kind of like broad strokes from a distance. But yeah, you consider how Thorwald, he's irritated by this disabled, nagging wife spouse. Jeff suspects Thorwald of murdering his wife. And again, I think it could be a bit of a wish fulfillment in terms of, being free of Lisa. I want to quote here John Belton. He's the author of the book Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, who wrote this. He said, "A common reading of the film views Jeff as a spectator figure, and what he sees out his window as a screen upon which his own desires are projected. Thorwald functions as Jeff's id, and the murder as the projection of Jeff's unconscious desires to rid himself of Lisa.
There you go.
Jeff undergoes an Aristotelian catharsis that purges his fears about marriage. He has symbolically exorcised the demon within himself." So I kind of agree with that. But also, you mentioned the newlyweds. What do they do? Well, they're copulating like rabbits, right? So if Jeff's broken leg, Josh, is a symbol of impotence, if you assign it as such, perhaps he wishes he could be as virile and active as the newlywed husband, and fears of being able to perform with Lisa are present here. So to compensate for his impotence, maybe Jeff uses this ostentatiously huge telephoto lens, which is, of course, a phallic symbol. And the itches he needs to scratch, if you read it as such, are kind of like sudden sexual urges that need release, if you know what I mean. So
yeah,
it's one way to look at it. You don't have to agree with it.
No, I think that's all there for sure.
Yeah, if you choose to look at it that way. But yeah, you mentioned Miss Torso. She stands as, of course, this voluptuous object of desire who enjoys wearing less clothing. And that contrasts with Lisa, a glamorous fashionista who adores clothing. So it's just a lot of fun to pick apart some of these characters and see how they reflect upon Jeff and Lisa.
And I think some of these questions, you can trace through Hitchcock's other films, particularly of this era. If we're moving, toward Vertigo and Psycho, you can see elements like this pop up in those movies as well.
No question about it. But again, the main takeaway is, Lisa is willing to, as I said, step out of her comfort zone. She shows courage, intelligence, and a willingness to engage with Jeff's world. And by doing so, I think she bridges the gap between their differing lifestyles. And as a result, you see in his own face how turned on he is by what she's doing. Jeff starts to appreciate Lisa's qualities. He reconsiders his reservations about their relationship, and I think he realizes the value of her companionship and support. And yeah, she's going to have to continue to hide the fashion magazines if she wants to maintain that good feeling. But again, you and I know, whether it's marriage or just a continuing unmarried relationship, there's going to be compromises ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's the intriguing question about the end of Rear Window. It's a great joke that it ends on, and I'm glad it's there because it shows that Lisa has not completely given herself over to his life. But I don't know if I feel necessarily all that more confident in them as a couple. That they're maybe in a little bit better place than they were at the beginning of the movie, but I think they probably still have some stuff to work out.
Well, I think, like I said, the double broken leg conundrum is hopefully going to humble him a bit more and make him more appreciative of her. But again, it's Hitchcock and he's winking at us here, and things may not work out, so who knows. But of course, another huge theme of the film is voyeurism, right? Scopophilia, practice of watching people, as well as you said, watching movies, watching television, watching an entertainment screen, which the windows function as. So you got window frames, hallways, door frames. To me, they obviously symbolize the cinematic frame, as if each of these were a private movie choice for Jeff and the audience. And you mentioned this, Thorwald, and how he represents himself in that screen. But I also, he kind of breaks this escapist viewing fantasy by doing what? By figuratively stepping out of the screen. He crosses that framing threshold when he literally trespasses into Jeff's private world. And suddenly, it's not just channel surfing anymore. The real world has converged, crashed upon Jeff's world, and it's serious business. But yeah, this whole theme of voyeurism, what would you like to say about it? What's your take?
Yeah, what you said about Thorwald, I think is crucial because he's not, really the most intimidating figure if you just look at him, but I think it's how he's employed. What you just described is that even though there's that really terrifying shot of him in the dark with his cigar lighting up, he's still at a distance, at a reserve, and it startles us. And maybe seeps into our subconscious and sits there for the rest of the movie, but we don't feel immediately threatened.
Right.
When he does, as you say, leave his screen and enter into ours, then suddenly it's more of this metaphysical threat represented by this, otherwise average looking guy. But now it's an average looking guy who we thought was safe in a viewing box and has now come at it. Yeah, I think this is, for me, really what elevates Rear Window is that it's about not just voyeurism, but I think movie watching as voyeurism.
Yeah.
And the attendant guilt we sometimes feel over that, whether or not we should feel any guilt, where that guilt comes from, what it's about. These are all the sort of questions. Hitchcock is not a moralizer at all. If anything, he wants to stir the pot. He wants to create something that will make us moral agents and then think about how we acted as those agents. I think that's what his best movies are really interested in. So here, this one is about that act of watching movies. A couple of things you mentioned are indicators of that. The windows going up like movie theater curtains as well. That comment, Stella has about being a race of peeping Toms. And yeah, I think this is very crucial to, I don't want to say the concerns or the lesson that Rear Window wants to give us, but more, this is the pot that Hitchcock wants to stir, and he does it so effectively.
So interesting and well articulated. Completely agree. And then another major takeaway here is the dark side of human nature may be closer than you think, right? Because Rear Window insinuates that even our next door neighbors or the individuals in our community we would least suspect, they could have a darkness within them. One of these nearby residents is a peeping Tom. Another is a cold-blooded killer. And I think this latent darkness is exemplified, Josh, by the shadows we continue to see fall across Jeff's face. It's very telling to me. We observe how his visage becomes shaded when, for example, he wheels in and out of the light during his spying, when Lisa leans in upon his waking figure for a kiss, or when Thorwald enters Jeff's apartment.
Yeah.
Even Lisa herself casts this suggestively ominous shadow on the ceiling, if you recall. Here I'm going to read you. This is D.K. Holm, a reviewer, who said in his review that Rear Window is about the subterranean darkness beneath the surface of our lives, the world that few see. Beneath its surface, the film is a tense examination of the way we really are. It's not a flattering portrait. There is, in fact, one undeniable reflection of Jeffries among all his neighbors, Thorwald. Besides Jeffries, he's the only other person in the film who looks intensely out his back window at his neighbors. And to me, Josh, this implies that Jeffries and Thorwald are opposite sides of the same problematic coin.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I'm hesitant to implicate Jeff too much or accuse him too much because, boy, can I see myself if I were in that situation just watching out that window too.
Oh, sure. I can
like,
too. Yes.
You know, it's like so easy. But yeah, the two sides of the same coin thing is definitely interesting. And that goes back to the complicity question, which again is one of my favorite things about Hitchcock. And I think we definitely see the darkness in the everyday or the seemingly innocuous in Psycho.
Oh, yeah.
Like that is to me the true descent into how dark things can get behind a friendly face. And we're veering a little bit into Psycho territory here, but the genius of that movie is it making us empathize with this killer.
Completely.
Even after we know who he is, the monster that he is. That scene of him trying to, you know, to get the car to sink in the swamp so he's not caught. And Hitchcock, again, teasing with us, makes it sort of sink a little and then stop. And what do we want? We want it to sink. Like we're rooting for it to sink, right?
He's playing us like a violin. Yes.
Yeah. And so there's some of that going on. To take it back to your, you know, your observation about the shadow side of people. There's a very, very dark and ominous shadow in Psycho, and there's a shading of that definitely in Thorwald and to a degree, Jeff as well in Rear Window.
Absolutely. And recall that the only neighbor who literally reflects in his telephoto lens is Thorwald. That's the only other image we see reflected. If you recall, when he's holding up the big telephoto lens.
Yeah.
So again, that's another hint from Hitchcock that, yep, maybe two sides of the same coin. And one last takeaway is that human behavior is unpredictable, right? I mean, you recall how Miss Lonely Hearts prepares to commit suicide. Maybe you didn't see that coming. Okay, Miss Torso ultimately chooses this nerdy, smaller man. Thorwald kills his wife and a dog. Jeff's supposedly delicate socialite girlfriend defies his expectations by breaking into Thorwald's apartment. So there are several examples where maybe you didn't see some of this coming plot-wise, but more importantly, human behavior can be pretty unpredictable.
Yeah, for sure. And that's another benefit of having all of these supporting characters who we're able to slot them into their identities. We've been watching them. We think they know who they are. And so it's all the more surprising when they make an unexpected turn.
Totally. So it is Rear Window's 70th birthday, Josh. Birthdays are a time for giving presents. Only it's movie lovers who continue to receive the gifts. Now, you suggest that movies are prayers. I also maintain that movies are gifts. So what is Rear Window's greatest gift to viewers, Josh?
I just think it reminds us that great movies can also be great entertainments. And I think when it comes to, you know, this sort of goes back to why it's my default answer for my favorite movie of all time, is that I love that it's both. You know, movies, it's a popular art form. It always has been. And I have a soft spot for movies that can be popular and entertaining, yet also carry within them the degree of depth that we've been exploring on this whole episode. And so I think that is Rear Window's gift, is that a popular movie doesn't have to be a dumb movie or a movie without a lot of going on thematically. It can be both things at once. It's rare. They're rare jewels. I think, another one like this is probably Casablanca. But yeah, for me, that's Rear Window's gift, is being one of those rare jewels.
It's a good call. Like, I think of North by Northwest. It's probably my number 4 Hitchcock. It's immensely entertaining. It may not be as deep, right? It may not be as thematically rich to me. But wow, when you want a really crunchy plot that pays off and it is thrilling and satisfying and so forth, you can't do much better than Rear Window or North by Northwest. But what helps Rear Window rise to the top for me is, as you mentioned, it satisfies on multiple levels, not just plot.
And how the craft too, there's immense craft going on in certain sequences in North by Northwest, like the airplane sequence is taught in film schools, right? But in Rear Window, it's where that craft is wedded to the theme and at the same time being immensely entertaining.
Completely, right. So what are you working on that listeners should know about? What's coming up on Film Spotting, for example, that maybe you'd like to mention? And for that matter, where can our audience follow you on social or otherwise, Josh?
Yeah, well, we're celebrating the anniversaries or birthdays of a couple other classics coming up on the show. We do keep up with new releases. Just this week, we have a discussion of M. Night Shyamalan's Trap, but we're also doing some of these revisits. So Apocalypse Now is ahead, and a little movie called The Wizard of Oz. So I can't wait to revisit both of those. And yeah, otherwise, besides the books that you kindly mentioned, Movies Are Prayers and Fear Not, my day job is as a senior producer over at Think Christian, where we do look at pop culture through the lens of faith. And as far as social media goes, Larsen on Film, Larsen on Film, whatever social media platform you use, chances are you'll be able to find me there. And you could also find my website there too, Larsen on Film.
There you go. Awesome. Multiple ways to get a hold of you or to listen to what you're working on. So, Josh, it was great fun speaking with you today about your all-time favorite movie, Rear Window, and one of mine, too. Keep up the great work on Film Spotting. Really love the show, and thanks again for taking the time to appear on our program.
Thank you, Eric. This was a lot of fun.
It's always fun when we can line up a guest for a particular movie that happens to be that guest's all-time favorite, right? We call that Cineversary Serendipity. Gratitude galore, Josh, for speaking with me at length this month. Did you know that Cineversary has its own website? That's right, we actually now have a vanity URL that's easy to remember, which will take you to a freshly designed portal where you can quickly access the latest episode of your favorite podcast, as well as all of our previous installments. Now it's a lot easier to spread the good word about our show to your friends and family. You simply tell them to visit Cineversary.com. Pretty simple, right? That's Cineversary.com. We also have a custom email address just for you. Now, if you ever want to share feedback on our show or offer suggestions for future installments, or maybe you just have a question about Cineversary, send it to us at cineversarypodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can really help our show grow by spreading the good word about the Cineversary show to your peeps. Even better, please leave a positive online review and rating, which significantly helps us to get discovered by new listeners. So if you use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, some of these other services, simply search for the Cineversary page, look for a link that says something like ratings or reviews, click that link, and leave a review and or rating. While you're at it, take a moment to like us on Facebook. We also have a presence on Twitter. Our handle is @CineversaryPod, where you can easily tweet or follow us. And if you want to go an extra step in your support of our show and help keep us ad-free, please consider making a monetary donation to the Cineversary podcast by visiting tinyurl.com/donate-cineversary. We really appreciate your support. Lastly, have you checked out my Cineverse Group website? Yeah, it's easy to get confused by these similar sounding names, Cineversary, Cineverse, Tomato. But Cineverse is actually the name of my private film discussion group I founded back in 2005 that continues to meet weekly on Zoom. Every week, the Cineverse group watches, researches, and discusses a different movie, and I create a summary write-up, call it a mini essay if you will, on that movie that gets posted to the Cineverse group blog. So if you want to enjoy reading in-depth content that examines different discussion-worthy motion pictures, including classic Hollywood films, independent features, foreign masterworks, modern movies, and silent-era standouts, then visit cineversegroup.com, simply spelled CINEVERSE group.com. Fun fact, every posted article on cineversegroup.com includes a link to a recording of our group discussion of that particular film, with me leading the conversation as moderator. So if you like what I'm doing on the Cineversary podcast, you might also want to give a listen to some of our Cineverse Group recordings, which are podcasts of a different sort. Again, head over to cineversegroup.com, where you can check out some interesting text and audio content on a variety of films, not necessarily celebrating a milestone anniversary. There have been many great movies about jail, incarceration, and the hope of escape, from The Grand Illusion and Brute Force to A Man Escaped and Cool Hand Luke. But the Citizen Kane of prison films continues to be The Shawshank Redemption, which first hit theaters in September 1994. Next month, Cineversary shines the searchlights upon this modern masterwork as we honor the 30th anniversary of The Shawshank Redemption. On Until then, this is your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and yes, indeed, cherish those classic movies because they're not getting older, they're getting better. Much obliged for giving us a listen.